Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining. My name is Jose Gaona, and I'm the VP of Product Strategy at Replicant. Replicant is a leader in cloud-based time tracking applications. We have over 7,800 customers worldwide and address many different types of time tracking needs, including time and attendance and labor compliance. Replicant is excited to sponsor today's webinar on the topic of calculating overtime. And we're very pleased to have Brian Dixon of Littler Law Firm to join us and present the webinar. This is the 5th of 6 webinars of our compliance series. Last month, Brian Dixon delivered a great webinar on understanding the minimum wage to help companies ensure that they are complying with that requirement. Today, we tackle the topic of calculating overtime. Miscalculating of overtime is a source of much litigation today. In fact, over 88% of FSLA back wages collected were due to overtime violations. So this is one area you want to understand and to get right. This webinar is going to be a little technical, so we are going to definitely provide you with the PowerPoint. Today we are fortunate to have Brian to help us sort through all of these overtime calculations. However, before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items. First, we'd like to let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. You'll be kept on mute during the presentation, but you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation by using the question text box located at the right panel of your screen. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that you are eligible to receive HRCI credit for attending this webinar. This webinar has been approved by HRCI, recertification credit. You will receive an email with certification information. Please stay on for the complete webinar in order to receive it. Now, let me introduce to you our guest and get started with our program. I'm very pleased to introduce Brian Dixon. Mr. Dixon is a shareholder at Littler San Francisco office and co-chair of the firm's nationwide wage and hour practice group. Mr. Dixon is a graduate of Stanford University School of Law and has served on the Wage Board and California's Industrial Welfare Commission. Mr. Dixon provides a full range of counsel representation with respect to employment and labor laws. His particular expertise is disputes regarding minimum wages, overtime, prevailing wages, and incentive compensation. Mr. Dixon is the author of the Federal Wage and Hour Laws, published by SHRM, and the general editor of the Wage and Hour Answer Book. He is a contributing author to the Fair Labor Standards Act and Wage and Labor Laws, a state-by-state survey published by the ABA and California Wage and Hour Law and Litigation, published by the California Bar Association. Please welcome Brian Dixon.
Thank you, Jose. And welcome everyone to this morning's webinar. As Jose has pointed out, we have a more technical undertaking in front of us. A fair amount of it revolves around that horrific 4-letter word called math. So realizing that we probably have a combination of both HR and payroll folks on the phone, and that the HR side of the house may have found that HR is a lot more sympathetic to their disinterest in math, we need to fasten our seatbelts and be prepared to move forward. The focus of today's presentation, again, is the regular rate of pay and how it is appropriately calculated. And if we can go to the next slide, then I will give us a little bit more of a, this is your sort of Miranda rights for the morning. This is a very detailed subject, and more so than in any of the other presentations, it's very important to realize that we're summarizing at certainly at a reasonable level. We'll get into probably, in some cases, more detail than you might want on some of the calculations, but it is a very technical subject, and I encourage you to get a copy of the webinar presentation and to make sure that for any question that you do have, you get an answer less by what I might say is intuition and more by looking explicitly at some reference materials or talking to a knowledgeable labor counsel. That being said, we will go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what our agenda is for this morning. And that is what types of compensation can actually increase an employee's overtime rate of pay above the base hourly wage. And that takes us to the entire concept of what I call the regular rate. Notice that overtime is a multiple of the regular rate. It is not a multiple of an employee's base hourly wage. And of course, just to make the presentation interesting, we have things that are both included in the regular rate and excluded from the regular rate. And some of those are probably intuitively apparent to you, such as benefits. And thirdly, we have credits against overtime. Credits are the things that we look for the most, appreciate the most. And those are things that are both excluded from the regular rate, and then you can use them as an offset against the overtime as due. And finally, at the end, just to make sure that we have a suitably challenging presentation, we have examples. Originally I was going to call it the quiz, but it's really just examples of how overtime is calculated. And why don't we go on to the next slide and start thinking about overtime. And what I'd really like to do is to start with those three categories that we talked about on the agenda slide, because if you get a good understanding of them, then the only thing that's left is the math. So let's focus on those three concepts. And let's learn about them by asking some questions. Should an employer be able to avoid the financial burden of overtime by moving money into bonuses and commissions? And we want to remember that overtime is supposed to be a burden, and anything that we're doing in the overtime calculations that looks like it's just too quick and easy probably is too quick and easy, because overtime is supposed to be a burden. Overtime came to us during the Great American Depression. It had two purposes, really. One was to limit individual employees' hours of work, but the other really was to spread employment throughout the community. When the Federal Overtime Act was first passed, it did use the expression the regular rate of pay, but it didn't define it. And it was only in 1947 when Congress amended the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act to clearly define what was included and what was excluded from the regular rate of pay. And that's known as Section 7E of the FLSA, for those of you who happen to be handy with statutes or on Google. So we want to intuitively understand that if overtime is supposed to be a burden, it would be too easy if we were to divide an employee's compensation into different parts and arbitrarily exclude anything other than a base hourly wage or a base salary. And if we then go on to the next slide, we'll ask our next question in terms of thinking about overtime, and that is, could we define the regular rate concept, that is all the things that are included in the overtime calculation, too broadly? Is there a risk there? And there is, because there are certain kinds of compensation that, quite frankly, Congress would like to see employers provide, and those are the standard fringe benefits, health benefits, retirement benefits, also expense reimbursements. Wouldn't want to pay overtime for that because that's money that's just sort of a reimbursement of an out-of-pocket expense, and vacation, holiday, and sick pay, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are excluded from the regular rate because the compensation other than for hours worked. And to go to the next slide and think a little bit more on the subject, what if we have an employer, a particularly beneficent employer, which imposes upon itself certain overtime-like obligations, such as paying time and a half for work on a holiday, or an extra half time for work on a Saturday or Sunday or regular day of rest. Those things are so overtime-like that they are the small category of things which Congress considers to be a potential credit against overtime. Now, I want to take a second here and reinforce the fact that there really are no substitutes for overtime. If you, for example, pay everyone a salary and you have extraordinarily generous fringe benefits, and the competitor down the street pays the minimum wage and time and a half on the minimum wage, the Department of Labor will audit you, send out a press release explaining all the things that you've done wrong as an employer to the detriment of your employees, and would laud the employer down the street that's paying much less but is paying overtime. No salary, no matter how high, is a substitute for overtime. The other thing that we want to appreciate is that we can't, this is a corollary to the notion that a salary isn't a substitute for overtime. You can't pay someone a salary and then pay them a fixed sum of money and say this is going to cover all of your overtime compensation. Overtime must vary with the number of hours that are worked in a week, just as the regular rate must vary with the number of hours that are worked in a week. So let's go on and take a look at our next slide and ask, how can we combine these concepts? And again, because this is a fairly technical subject, I'm going to go a little more slowly, and we're going to overlap each of our ideas a little bit to try to provide more continuity and to recap occasionally in order to reinforce the key points. And this is our first recap. All of an employee's compensation is going to go into 3 categories. And it's important to identify which category, obviously, that a particular type of compensation goes into, and we'll come back to each, common types of compensation and where do they fit. But those are compensation that goes into the regular rate of pay, commissions, bonuses, things that are intuitively wage-like, things that are retirement benefits and some of the other things we discussed, and then that very small category of overtime-like premiums. They're easy to spot. You can tell them when you see them. It's extra, usually half-time for work on a Saturday, Sunday holiday. That is excluded from the regular rate of pay. And if we roll forward once more, we will then go, well, okay, Brian, you've told us how to calculate the regular rate of pay. How do I get to overtime? And the regular rate, again, is you take all the remuneration that goes into the regular rate of pay, you divide it by all the hours worked in the week, that's your regular rate. And obviously the regular rate is going to float above base salary or base hourly wage if you're paying commissions, bonuses, shift premiums, on-call pay, things like that. And you pay 1/2 of the regular rate for each overtime hour. Notice that the basic formula is focused on the week, and it is true that the regular rate varies every week. You have to have payroll software which is sufficiently robust to make that calculation. And for many years when I practiced wage and hour law, payroll software tended to be massive because there's huge amounts of data that have to flow through it. But it tended to be rather simplistic on the regular rate concept and didn't always provide the opportunities you needed. With the wave of wage and hour litigation that is washed back and forth across the United States over the last 10 years, payroll software has become much more sophisticated. And if you don't have a software program that allows you to calculate the regular rate and express it on a paycheck stub, I would respectfully suggest that you need to go back to your vendor and update your version. I would imagine they have a later version that might be suitable, or you might actually have to look for another vendor. I don't pretend to endorse or criticize any vendor. I just want you to make sure that you have a process that will allow you to do that. And of course, the underlying key here is we also have to recognize how many hours of work we are, and as pointed out by Jose, Replicant forte is assembling and managing that hours of work data. So what would life be without a special rule for California? So let's look at the special rule for California. And before we get to the special rule for California, let's take one other thought off the last slide. And that is, I keep talking about overtime as an additional half time. And it is best thought of that, and it's best expressed that way on your paycheck stub. Why is it easier to think about overtime as half time instead of time and a half? And here's an example. So when employees pay $10 for the first 40 hours of work and $15 an hour for the hours of work over 40, that, there's time and a half. That looks good. But once we start to think about, okay, so that employee worked the first 2 shifts of the week were on the night shift. We pay an extra hour for the night shift. So that means the regular rate's going to go up. So $15 doesn't work anymore, so I need to increase the 15 to something else. You might be able to manage that math, but what if we move that additional compensation for the night shift to the last hours of the week, to the last 10 hours of the week? What are we going to do then? And then, we're sitting here scratching our heads, so to speak, about how do we get to an appropriate time and a half rate. And the answer really lies in the second of the alternatives, which is here, and that is if you conceive of overtime as an additional half-time premium and you pay it separately from an employee's base hourly wage, then everything becomes much simpler. So if we have our employee here who's paid $10 an hour, works 50 hours, okay, the paycheck stub would show $10 an hour, 50 hours. We have 16 hours of night shift at $1 an hour. Paycheck stub shows 16 times 1, an additional compensation there. Maybe the employee received a bonus for exceptional productivity. Boom, that shows up as a line item. We then add everything together. We do the division. We come up with the regular rate. We calculate the halftime, and there is an additional line item that says overtime premium, halftime, very easily stated. Let's go forward a little bit further and just think about how this process works from beginning to end. We calculate the regular rate of pay, a little bit of a recap here. We calculate the statutory overtime that's due, the additional halftime of the regular rate of pay. We subtract any credits at that point, and we then pay the balance. And those are all the steps to correctly calculating overtime, again, for each week, because everything in the overtime arena is driven by the week. You calculate your overtime based on the week. You calculate your regular rate based on the week. And yes, that's true. If you have a 2-week pay period, you could have different regular rates and different overtime premiums, premium rates, halftime rates in those 2 weeks. One more step forward. And the regular rate includes all remuneration subject to limited exceptions. We've talked about that. We've talked about how the regular rate floats upwards. Again, it's calculated each week, pay 1/2 of the regular rate. Credits can be taken for certain overtime like premiums. And again, a little bit of a recap because I want to get us used to these concepts of a weekly regular rate, regular rate being higher than the base wage, halftime premium for overtime, and again, a very limited population of credits that can be taken against overtime. And one more step forward. And now we come to California's special rule regarding the regular rate of pay. What would a presentation about wage and hour be without a special rule for California? And that California's rule basically is you can't have a salary or something that looks like a salary, a lump sum bonus, stretch out to cover more than 40 hours of work in a week. And that actually prohibits an employer in California from using a particular kind of a pay plan known as a fluctuating work week pay plan. The fluctuating work week pay plan is simply a reflection of the federal rule that if you have a salary and the salary is paid for all your hours of work, whether many or few, you could calculate the overtime by dividing the hours worked into the salary. And as more hours are worked, the halftime rate actually declines somewhat. Overall compensation increases because you're paying that halftime premium for additional hours, but the rate at which an employee's pay is increases is much more modest. And there are a few states, including California, Montana is another, I believe, and 2 or 3, perhaps more, that prohibit the use of that kind of a pay plan. And again, that rule, very simply stated, is that a salary can't stretch out to cover more than 40 hours of work in a week. And you can think of that rule in 2 ways. One is that you pay time and a half on the salary, divide the salary by 40 and pay time and a half. The other way to think about it which I think is a lot more convenient and sort of fits with what we've been talking about earlier, is the salary can only cover 40 hours of work in a week, so you have to pay the time portion of the time and a half, which is the salary divided by 40, and then you calculate your regular rate in the usual fashion after you have extended the salary hour by hour to provide the base portion of an employee's pay. And of course, in California, if you pay an employee by the hour, you don't divide the total, and you pay for 50 hours of work, you don't divide 50 hours of pay by 40 to come up with the regular rate, because in that case, the hourly pay keeps growing with every additional hour of work, and the regular rate won't decline if you divide the total hours paid for by the total hours worked. So things like piece rate compensation and commissions, which increase just like an hourly wage would increase hour by hour, are divided by total hours worked, and you pay 1/2 of the result. That's true even in California. So if, for example, you had an employee who's paid by a salary and commissions, you would divide, the salary by 40 and pay time and a half on it, but you'd divide the commissions by the total hours worked and pay an additional 1/2 on those commissions. Little wrinkle can cause some confusion in the quiz portion of our program, the examples, which we'll come to at the end. We'll revisit this concept to make sure that we have it in hand. And let's take another step forward. Regular rate of pay, inclusions, exclusions, and credits. And if we look at these in detail, we're going to talk about what's included and what's excluded from the regular rate. Compensation included, hourly wages or salary, that's a given. Commissions included in the regular rate of pay. Non-spontaneous bonuses, and this is a Brianism. You'll see a lot of presentations talk about discretionary bonuses versus non-discretionary bonuses, but the fact that a bonus is discretionary doesn't alone get you out of the regular rate of pay. We'll come back to that. We're going to have examples of each of these as the program continues. Shift or job differentials, night shift, day shift, lead person premiums, a foreman premium, all of those things go to the regular rate. On-call pay, and we might stop and think for a second and say, wow, that's odd. When an employee's on call, usually on-call time is not work time. We talked about that in the hours work portion of this series. And let's assume that on-call time is not work time. And let's assume that you pay an employee 1 hour of pay for every evening that they're on call and 2 hours for every weekend they're on call, even though they're not working. That money, even though paid for time which is not worked, goes into the regular rate of pay. And then the value of meals regularly provided. You're going, well, wait a minute. What am I supposed to include in the regular rate? Am I going to give you like an extra half of a French fry for every meal I gave you at my fine restaurant, for every overtime hour you worked? And the important thing to understand here is that in-kind compensation can also drive up the regular rate of pay. You have to assign a value to the meals and include that value when you calculate the overtime premium. And the value is essentially cost. It is not the retail value of the meal. The value excludes labor if that meal is produced, say, without any additional labor cost. But if you were such a beneficent employer that you maintained a separate employee cafeteria with a separate staff of people who cook for the employees, then you would have to include that labor cost as well as the cost of the food when you calculate the value. Same thing would occur if you offered your non-exempt employees, that we have an inside sales force, non-exempt employees, the best salesperson of the year will get a set of golf clubs, or perhaps at the employee's election, a new set of gourmet cookware. The value of the clubs or the cookware would have to go into the regular rate of pay at the end of the year in order to make sure you discharge your overtime obligation. Let's see what's excluded from the regular rate of pay, and that is benefits provided through third parties, payments for time not worked, sick leave, vacation, and the like, reimbursements for business expenses. Again, we come back to the credits, certain very overtime like forms of premium pay. Gifts, we're still allowed to give gifts. It's a little bit reassuring. We're not in the holiday season, but the Christmas turkey or ham is still, or the holiday turkey or ham is still excluded. And spontaneous bonus. Let's look at some of these in a little more detail. And go ahead and look at employee benefits. And again, intuitively, we probably, and perhaps because, in our own working lives, these things have been excluded from overtime premiums, retirement plan, life insurance plan, accident plan. Every once in a while, I run into a health-like benefit that's paid by the employer. And if, for example, your health plan consists of nothing more than, if you give us the bill, we will, pay your doctor's bill for you, that would be included in the regular rate of pay because it's not a contribution irrevocably made to a trustee or third party. Now, if you have a formal self-insurance plan, that's considered sufficiently formal. You have a fiduciary who's responsible for administering the plan, a trustee, so to speak. You wouldn't have to include that in the regular rate. But we need to realize that the safety valve from Congress's point of view here was that if the money is given to a third party and it's limited to providing a particular form of benefit, it's excluded from the regular rate. There are some things that you can pay as directly from payroll that are excluded from the regular rate that look like benefit plans. Certain profit-sharing plans, profit-sharing bonuses are excluded, but we need to realize that in order to be excluded, the amount can't vary based upon the quality of an employee's work or the quantity of an employee's work, and it has to be a pure profit-sharing plan. When I look at profit-sharing plans that employers sometimes show me, asking, hey, do we have a regular rate issue here? The one variable that comes back most often to contribute to the conclusion that the profit-sharing bonus has to go in the regular rate is that the profit-sharing bonus has been modified to include, for example, a return on investment component. Not really profit. It has to be a pure profit-sharing plan. Also, not uncommon to find a modifier, based upon quality of work, which will, we increase the profit-sharing bonus up and down based upon the quality of your work, and again, that will cause the profit-sharing bonus to go in the regular rate. Stock option plans, there was some interesting, Congress didn't really anticipate stock option plans being extended to non-exempt employees until about, I want to say late 1990s, around the year 2000, when Congress somewhat belatedly amended the FLSA to add that as the 8th category of compensation excluded from the regular rate of pay. And there are a number of detailed requirements there in terms of vesting and the like. And basically, Congress wants to avoid the stock option plan being a sort of slam dunk where we give you the option to invest tomorrow and you've got cash and you can convert it to cash, which would be obviously a transparent dance to get around the notion that overtime should be a burden and that all of an employee's regular compensation should go into the overtime calculation. And let's go and look at the next category of compensation or remuneration. Cafeteria plans. Again, you can see some rules. Some cafeteria plans do have a cash back option if you waive out of certain benefits. Here's the rule. It's fairly straightforward, easy to apply. Again, Congress doesn't want to think that the cafeteria plan or a trip to the dishwasher in the cafeteria plan, so to speak, it allows you to launder the cash back out of the regular rate of pay. That's fine tolerance. And again, a lot of the regular rate concepts, especially around fringe benefits, are very rule-driven, a little bit like ERISA. There's a rule for everything. Also, a little bit of a challenge to apply, but we do want to keep the general concept in mind as well. And let's go ahead and look at payments for non-work time. So we provide vacation, holiday, and sick leave. Do I have to include that in the regular rate? Well, if you had an employee who was out sick one day in the week, on holiday another day of the week, and on vacation another day in the week, and then worked some hours after that, perhaps some daily overtime here in California, and worked 9 hours on the last day of the week, you might say, wow, the regular rate's going to be skewed upwards if I include this pay for time not worked in the regular rate. And that's true. It would be skewed ridiculously upwards. And for that reason, hours which you pay for but which are not worked are excluded from the regular rate calculation. There are some employers that will count, for example, vacation time as work time for the purpose of determining when overtime occurs. And if you do that, then the vacation goes into the regular rate of pay, because if, for example, you counted the vacation hours as work time, but then count the vacation pay as work time, you would skew the regular rate downwards. You'd be dividing the pay for the hours actually worked by the hours worked and the vacation hours, and again, you get an artificially low amount. So we have a general rule there. We have a special exception which applies, and that applies only if you count your vacation, holiday, and or sick leave as hours worked. Talk about business expenses. Reasonable payments made to reimburse employees for bona fide expenses are excluded from the regular rate. I think one of the challenges here, especially in California, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, and to a degree in Iowa, Washington, D.C., and New Hampshire, where you actually have to reimburse employees for expenses in the latter 3 states or the last 3 states for travel expenses. You have to not only reimburse, but if you over-reimburse, you wind up with an inclusion to the regular rate of pay. And, of course, a reasonable per diem can work as a expense reimbursement. Here in California, only the net amount of that per diem or cash allowance can be counted towards the expense reimbursement obligation. Sometimes the Department of Labor is inclined to believe that employers play games with the expense reimbursement. And many years ago, I had a case with the DOL where a construction industry employer had a reimbursement program, expense reimbursement program. The company had a mobile workforce, operated job sites all around the United States, and the expense reimbursement happened to be 1/2 of your base hourly wage. And you were only reimbursed for your expenses for the first 40 hours of work in a week. And as the Department of Labor pointed out, for the first 40 hours of work in a week, you got your straight time and 1/2 of that as an expense reimbursement. And for the overtime hours, you got your base wage, and you got 1/2 of that for overtime. And if you did the math, it was really straight time, in their view, for all the hours worked in the week. And that was a little bit of a challenge to overcome. I might say that the optic there was not favorable to the employer. The other thing the Department of Labor challenged, which was interesting, was that the workforce was so itinerant that reimbursing them for travel expenses wasn't appropriate. They had no fixed place of abode. As the DOL pointed out, many of these workers had campers, trailers. They went wherever the work was, and they had no fixed place of residence. So they really had no travel expense because they weren't traveling away from their home. They were taking their home a little bit turtle-like with them. So we want to be, and I say that just to sensitize us to the fact that, again, overtime is intended to be a burden. And if you over-reimburse employees for expenses, you're really paying them for their daily, in a wage-like fashion, for whatever they want to use that funds for. And if you reimburse an employee for things like the cost of gasoline for driving to work in the morning and going home, those are day-to-day expenses the employee is expected to bear, and that would be included in the regular rate. Let's go on to the welcome subject of gifts. Gifts are always good. More gifts is better. But there are some circles that have been drawn around gifts that are excluded from the regular rate of pay. It has to be on an appropriate gift-like occasion, a birthday, end-of-the-year holidays, the Thanksgiving turkey, the Christmas ham. You can't vary the gift based upon an employee's hours of work or efficiency or production, and the gift can't be so substantial that it looks like part of an employee's pay. I think that gives us a good, you have to be able to look at the subject and think, is the expression of value really gift-like in nature? Go on to one of my favorite subjects, which is spontaneous bonuses. And if we, again, look at the next slide, the line that's drawn, I think most appropriately drawn, is between bonuses and spontaneous bonuses, and not between bonuses and discretionary bonuses. And the reason is any bonus, at least in the Department of Labor's view, which is not decided upon immediately before it is paid, and the amount is decided upon immediately before it is paid, goes into the regular rate of pay. So if you have announced, for example, an annual performance bonus plan where we will assess your performance in the discretion of the company, it's discretionary, but the regular payment, the expectation on the part of the employees that if I work harder and I do a better job, I will get a larger sum of money, will cause that bonus to be included in the regular rate of pay. And, you know, there aren't that many bonuses that are really sufficiently spontaneous that we might exclude them from the regular rate of pay. I always think of that as, you know, the supervisor walking in from the parking lot, turning to the production crew and saying, you know, I've never seen a bluer sky or a more golden sun. Here's $5. Would be about the best measure of a spontaneous bonus. And let's talk about credits against overtime, just like being, bonus prizes and awards before we go to credits, sorry. Again, most bonuses go in the regular rate of pay, retention bonus, safety bonus, value of trip to Hawaii, again, in-kind compensation. Certain prizes can be excluded from the regular rate of pay. For example, if you have a reward program where you give $25 to an employee who refers a qualified applicant to HR and that applicant is hired, it's excluded from the regular rate of pay. Notice that there's a corollary there, and that is the time spent in that activity should be voluntary, outside regular work hours, not related to an employee's regular duties, i.e. I'm not a recruiter in HR, you know, chatting up my friends at social events in order to try to complete my job duties. But if, you know, a production employee says, hey, you might want to interview Bill or Sally here, or Binky, and decide whether that individual should be hired, you would have a prize, so to speak, that would be excluded from the regular rate of pay. And here are some other examples. One that I would like to touch on for a moment is a bonus calculated as a percentage of total wages. Well, why would that be excluded from the regular rate of pay? And percentage bonuses are a particular valuable way of approaching how to pay a bonus without doing a lot of that four-letter word called math. If you increase, for example, let's say we pay a generous bonus of 10% of an employee's straight time and overtime, and we apply the 10% to the straight time and overtime, what have we done? We have rolled up the overtime premium in exactly the same proportion that we rolled up the straight time, which is exactly what Congress wants you to do when you pay a bonus in a lump sum. That is, you need to roll up, you need to distribute that bonus across the hours worked and then roll up the overtime in proportion to that, you know, so to speak, wage increase derived from the lump sum bonus. So percentage bonus plans are a very convenient way of paying a bonus and avoiding that four-letter word we call math. One more step forward, and we'll look at credits against overtime. And this is a unique category. Again, these are sums that are not only excluded from the regular rate, but they also serve as a credit on the back end of the overtime calculation. Because you remember from our earlier slide, we calculate the regular rate, we calculate the statutory overtime. We can then subtract any credits, and our obligation is to pay the net balance due. And for example, if you pay a holiday premium of an additional 1/2 of an employee's base wage, you could take that as a credit against overtime. I will point out that many employers who pay such a premium want to bear that burden, and while they could take the credit, they don't take the credit. Because if you work, say, on the 4th of July, and you also work, and assume that occurs on Wednesday, and you are kind enough to come in and work on the Saturday after the 4th of July, and you have 40 hours of work in the week, 48 hours of work in the week, you would have, and you took a credit for the halftime premium paid for the 4th of July work, the employee might say, hey, why'd I bother to come in and work on the 4th of July? And the answer might be, well, that is a good question. So most employers, while they could take this credit, they don't always do so. Sometimes, you know, and this becomes a little more subtle, certainly if you're paying a premium for work on Saturdays and Sundays, and the overtime happens to fall on Saturday and Sunday, you don't want to pay that premium twice. Or if you're an employer outside of a state that requires daily overtime, and you pay overtime for hours worked in excess of 8 a day, you don't really want to have to pay overtime on that a second time if the employee works more than 40 hours a week. So a little bit of a subtle subject, and one worth taking a little longer look at. Okay, let's go to examples. I originally called this the quiz slide, but it's really just examples. Let's look at our first example. Straightforward analysis. We've talked about this one a little bit before, but let's start here and stretch forward. Employees paid $10 an hour, receives $1 an hour for 15 hours of work on the night shift. Could be the swing shift, could be $1 an hour for being a lead person for a part of the day, or a charge nurse for part of the day. Works 50 total hours in the week. Math is pretty straightforward. $10 an hour times 50 hours plus $1 times 15 hours gives us a total remuneration for the week to be included in the regular rate, $515. Do the division, get our regular rate, $10.30. Half the regular rate is $5.15. So the overtime is going to be 10 overtime hours at $5.15, $51.50. And again, this paycheck would show 50 hours at $10 an hour, 15 hours at $1 an hour, 10 hours at $5.15 an hour, in order to express all the pay for this example. Next slide, please. And in our second example, we're going to talk, this is an example of the credit against overtime, assuming we pay the holiday premium and we want to take it as a credit. So we know that $51.50 in overtime is, the further elaboration is the employee is paid $5 an hour for 8 holiday hours of work, $40. So we're looking at that and we're saying, okay, is that excluded from the regular rate? It is. Is it also a credit? Yes, it falls in that that really narrow category. So we know we have a credit of $40 towards the overtime that's due. There's $51.50 in statutory overtime due. We'd subtract the credit of $40. The net amount due is $11.50. Go on and look at our third example. Employee is paid an annual salary of $52,000. This is a fluctuating workweek pay plan, and you can use, again, a fluctuating workweek pay plan outside of the 3-4 states that prohibit its use. Fluctuating workweek pay plans can be very valuable. There are some challenges with them. The whole premise of fluctuating workweek pay plan is that you get paid your salary for the week, whether you work many hours in the week or few hours in the week. So if you work 62 hours in the week, you just get that salary plus the halftime premium. If I work 2 hours in the week, I still get my whole salary for the week. So obviously there's some potential for abuse. The other thing about a fluctuating workweek pay plan is that the employee's hours do need to fluctuate. That's the whole premise, fluctuating workweek pay plan. And of course, the regular rate is going to change from week to week as you take the constant salary and you divide it by varying hours. That's, again, part of the fluctuating workweek. And here, this employee, through the magic of lawyer math, is paid exactly $52,000 in the year, which is $1,000 a week. And let's assume we have a biweekly pay period. In the first week of the biweekly pay period, the employee worked 50 hours. Take the $1,000, divide it by 50, divide it by 2 to get the halftime premium, times 10 overtime hours, $100 in overtime. Second week, twice as much in the way of overtime hours, but you see that the overtime has only increased by 2/3. So this is, very clearly the advantage of a fluctuating workweek pay plan. Your overtime cost increases more modestly. There are a couple important things to know about fluctuating workweek pay plans, in addition to the fact that there are 3 or 4 states that don't allow you to use them. And that is, the Department of Labor has taken the position that the salary which you pay for all your hours of work, whether many or few, in a week, the all there means that that's the only compensation. Very interesting interpretation of the word all. That's the only compensation you can have. So if you pay commissions, piece rate, bonuses, a special premium for, there was one recent case about employees Phantom Fluctuating Workweek Pay Plan, and the employer, out of the kindness of its heart, gave them an extra $25 a day when they were working offshore, and that ruined the Fluctuating Workweek Pay Plan. So there are two cases now pending in the Courts of Appeal, one in the Sixth Circuit, the other in the Second Circuit. Both concern Radio Shack. You might, if you're thinking about using a Fluctuating Workweek Pay Plan, or you have one in place, you want to keep an eye out for decisions in those cases. One of the things that I think that's important to understand is the Department of Labor has undertaken to update, in their view, change, make more limited the overtime exemptions for white-collar employees. Most significantly, we'll probably see a substantial increase in the base salary needed to be exempt. So employers may find for this new, more highly paid group of non-exempt employees that using a Fluctuating Workweek Pay Plan might be appropriate. You might wind up with 3 tiers of employees: hourly plus overtime, salaried plus overtime, half-time overtime, and then salaried exempt. So that's a little bit in the future, although I think the news flash this morning was the DOL is thinking they'll have proposed regs out in November, which would be amazingly quickly. More to talk about that later. Absolutely. And let's look at our fourth example. Here, we have an annual bonus. It's like, okay, so we pay the bonus on the last week of the year. Do I just include the whole thing in that week? And the answer is no. You spread the bonus back over the year, and you have to recalculate the overtime for every week in the year. And in the Department of Labor's view, there are sort of 3 ways to do that. The most appropriate way is to allocate that bonus in proportion to the amount of bonus that was earned in each week. We're sitting here probably thinking, okay, this was an annual sort of, we gave you this bonus because you did a very good job. Not an excellent job, not a good job, but a very good job, and let's figure out which weeks you were very good versus excellent. Obviously a challenge, very rarely used. The second option in the hierarchy is you allocate equal amounts to each work week, and then we say, okay, $100 goes into each work week. We do the math, we recalculate the overtime for each week, we go through a lot of trouble. The last, which the Department of Labor considers to be applicable only if the first 2 aren't practical, is actually the easiest to use, and it produces a slightly different arithmetic result. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little less than when you get to the other methods, although my experience has been it usually generates a higher overtime outcome, and it's easier to use. So a lot of employers go right to the end, and that is you take the bonus, you divide it by the total hours worked in the year, and you pay 1/2 of the result in one check as the overtime adjustment, the roll-up, the additional overtime that's due. So it will be total bonus divided by total hours, 1/2 the result, times the overtime hours is your answer. Now, let's go on and look at our 5th and last example. And that takes us back to California, where I might say it's the fog is now burning off in San Francisco. And we have an employee who's paid a salary of $500 per week. And this just recaps what we talked about earlier. In California, you divide the salary by 40, and you'd have to pay time and a half for the overtime. The easier way to think about this, and the way that it's actually easier to incorporate it in the payroll software, and frankly, what happens in California is basically anyone who's non-exempt employees paid a salary is being paid hourly for their overtime. You just extend the salary out hour by hour to provide the base wage. It would be $500 salary plus $12.50 for each additional hour of work, total the salary and the extension, do the math, divide by, and then pay half-time overtime. So you can think of it as time and a half, the salary divided by 40, pay time and a half, or you can think of extending the salary in a very hourly wage type fashion, and then you can go back to your conventional half-time calculation. One thing that I'd ask us to bear in mind, and if we could for a moment go back to the 4th example, go backwards one slide, we would say, hey, that lump sum bonus paid at the end of the year has this very salary-like feel about it. And that's true. In California, if you're paying a lump sum bonus, it probably falls in the same rule as a salary, and that is you can't divide it by more than 40 hours per week. And instead of dividing it by 2,200 hours worked in the year, you divide it by 2080. and then you would pay time and a half that amount as the overtime roll-up. Again, that would be a bonus that does not include, increase with the number of hours worked. Like, you did a good job, you did a great job, would be the kind of lump sum bonus we're thinking of. And let's go forward then, and Jose is going to talk a little bit about Replicant, and then we'll have time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Brian. That was great information. Yes, we wanted to share a little bit about Replicant. Replicant is a leader in cloud-based tracking applications worldwide. Here's a short list of our customers. And using the Replicant platform, the benefits are as follows: greater insight into your organization, lower compliance risk, and especially with our great, powerful payroll engine that we have, and we optimize processes. Replicant offers comprehensive products, specifically time and attendance, covering absence management, scheduling with a cloud-based time clock, as well as time tracking, including project tracking, costing, and billing. I do want to share with you all that this PowerPoint will be shared with you. We will email you the recorded presentation to all the participants. Well, thank you, Brian, and I'm sorry we're getting close to the end of our webinar here. We do have several other questions which we will provide to Brian so that he can answer those for you. But we do want to thank you again for participating in our webinar. And we'd like to also let you know that coming soon is the compliance webinar, in this compliance webinar series on July 10th, best practices for paying employees the correct amount and on time. For more information, please visit replicant.com, events and webinars. Thank you everyone for your time today.